This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with former GB judo player Tom Reed. The former Commonwealth silver medalist discusses his time as an athlete, as well as his transition into coaching with the University of Bath and his philosophies around giving athletes ownership of their own development. I hope you enjoy. Right, Tom, how are things?
Oh, very good, thanks, Mike. Good,
Yeah.
Very happy to be here in this very funky little office. I like it.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you doing this. Obviously, taking a bit of time out of your Monday morning and stuff. I guess first thing is kind of newish into the role here at the University of Bath. Do you just want to explain to people kind of what you're doing and how you've come into that and how it is?
Yeah, definitely. So, I've been here at the University of Bath as an athlete actually for a long time. So I started training here when I was 15. So it was at 2001. Just coming as a judo athlete, just in case listeners don't know. So yeah, coming here as a judo athlete. Eventually moved here, left the school when I was 17 to do my A-levels in Bath. Moved in with a host family and went full time as an athlete. So I trained here then for the next 13 years. So finished competing when I was 30. I didn't quite make the Rio Olympics. That was the end of my competitive career. And then went out for 3 years to Abu Dhabi. So my wife was out there as a nurse. So kind of my whole competitive career, I guess she'd followed me around or sort of put things on hold for my career. And that was my chance to kind of, I guess, repay that. So I went out there for 3 years and then came back January 2017 and got a role here as assistant coach for judo. So basically working on the same program that I was an athlete on. So my coach was Jürgen Klinger. He was here for 14 years. He's just recently retired from his time in Team Bath to move back to Germany. So Adam Hall, another one of the athletes from the same generation as me, has kind of become the new Jürgen, and then I've became the new Adam, if you like. So Adam was the assistant coach to Jürgen, and I'm now the assistant coach. So working with the full-time judo program here. We've got about 30 athletes, mostly university students, but some that have stayed beyond their university. A mixture of athletes kind of training. We've got some preparing for the Olympic Games right now. Other athletes much more on the development end of the scale, kind of coming through, trying to get to national level. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, that I'm working with those guys here. And then I'm kind of doing like support roles and bits and pieces with the England under-18s program. Just got one trip coming up with the GB under-21s program as well. So this is my day-to-day, but then other bits and pieces around that.
And so how did you find the transition from obviously rolling and being a judo player and stuff to then kind of taking it backwards step, and being a coach and all that type of stuff? How did you find that?
I think I really enjoy it, to be honest. I think I was one of those players who probably you would have said there's a good chance this person will become a coach. I think even as an athlete I was always inclined towards that a little bit. Just my mentality on the mat in terms of I enjoyed kind of instructing and helping others and that side of the sport. And I think that's quite hard to balance if you're that way inclined as an athlete, because you have to be quite focused. But as soon as I finished competing, it was a natural progression for me. It's what I wanted to do. So even when I was still competing, and from about, I'd say, halfway through 2015, so the last year of my career, I started training a couple of days a week as a player coach in Cardiff. So I was still based in Bath primarily, but then I would go there a couple of days a week to train, but also to help coach. And that was kind of the start of my coaching journey, I guess, at that level. I'd done bits and pieces with kids judo and stuff before. And then that was kind of what I planned to do. So I was really excited when I finished my career, there's the struggles around that, but I was really excited to get into coaching. But because of the situation with my wife being in another country, that kind of, I guess, took me away from that. It was always what I planned to do, but I had to step away from that a little bit. And when I went to Abu Dhabi, I did bits and pieces, but there's the judo system there is just not as developed as it is here. So the whole time I was there, although I had a good time, I was missing coaching, so I was eager to get back to it. And I think in the end, it's turned out to be quite a good thing that I had that break, because I've come back here, 3 years later. There's probably 4 or 5 athletes that were training at the same time as me, but the vast majority of them are new faces. So the people that I'm coaching now, they don't really see me as an athlete. They see me just as a coach, most of them. The ones that still see me as an athlete a little bit, that's probably the ones that are a little bit more challenging to work with. Just that, how to manage that relationship and where you draw the line between coach and friend and teammate and that kind of thing. But on the whole, it's been really good. And those players that I mentioned that I was teammates with have been really good as well, really supportive. So I'm sure I will face some challenging situations, but on the whole, it's been really good. I think coming back to a judo environment after 3 years away from it has probably brought up a few memories of being an athlete that probably I haven't resolved fully yet. So there's been a few, I guess, unanticipated struggles around that. But I think it's to be expected, really. I think you never fully retire from your career as a competitor in terms of your mentality. And I think still being in judo and allowing me to refocus that energy as a coach is quite positive in that way. So yeah, it's been really good. Really enjoying it so far. Yeah, like compared to working in a non-sporting environment and sort of going to it, which felt like work, this to me doesn't really feel like a job. There's a lot more to it than I anticipated. I'm spending a lot more time here, but I love doing it. So really enjoying it.
Have you got any examples of that kind of struggle from?
Yeah. So I went to Paris recently. So Paris Grand Slam is one of the biggest judo tournaments in the calendar. It's like the Wimbledon of judo. So it's not the World Championships or the Olympic Games, but it's just got that prestige and that sort of history of being such a big tournament. And as a player, I fought there in 2008, so 22, which is quite young to compete there for your first time. So, but then I never actually ended up competing there again. So my career was kind of on this good upward trajectory, and then didn't continue at the same pace, I guess. I was still on the circuit and doing well, but never got to where I thought I would get to. So I think going back to Paris and seeing it, I wasn't coaching, I was just a spectator, but it did bring back a few memories of that and kind of just makes you question a few things. And did I make mistakes, and could I have done things better? And why didn't I get to where I wanted to be to? Why didn't I achieve what I thought I would? And I think some of those questions you can try to answer, but some are difficult to answer. You just, for whatever reason, that wasn't your destiny. You weren't quite good enough. The stars weren't aligned. So some of those things you can't really work through and find an answer to. So just bringing up some of those questions again, I guess, which I hadn't really thought about for a couple of years, just because I've been in a different environment with different things going on, and just not thought about those things. So yeah, I kind of went through about a day and a half of daydreaming about making a comeback and could I still do it and all this sort of stuff. And then you realise actually, like, it's not, number one, you probably couldn't do it, but number two, it's not actually what you want to do anymore. You think there's a part of you, maybe there's a part of you that still wants to do it, but actually I'm actually really happy doing what I'm doing, and I feel like this is the right thing for me. But you still do that. You do get inclined to have those little daydreams and think about it. And I guess it just brought back a few of those memories, and I don't know if regrets is the right word, but just what might have been. So yeah, and I'm sure there'll be other times when I have the same thing, but it's important, I guess, to just deal with those things and speak to people and all that kind of stuff. So
I guess that's a positive of kind of you going from being an athlete to then going into coach. You can kind of relay those experiences to the athletes that are here now, or the ones that might be looking to move away from judo and all that type of stuff. Yeah,
definitely. I think it's the percentage of people that get to where even if they do achieve great things, I think everybody always wants more. So everybody probably finishes with some sense of not achieving quite what they wanted, and also on the journey. So there'll be athletes that are 18, 19, 20 that we're working with who aren't, they're going to have tournaments, they're going to have bad days. And I think the fact as a coach, from your experience as an athlete, it's good if you can relate to that. Doesn't mean I have the answers, and I can help them click my fingers and make it better, but I know how they're feeling, so we can have a conversation and relate to each other on that in that way. But yeah, I'm sure interesting, actually, again, not just speaking to the players here, but speaking to my ex-teammates about it as well, and sort of open up that conversation a little bit. And there's lots of them out there that have the same sort of feelings as me, and I think you just don't talk about it. But going there and having that come back kind of led me to then speak to more people, and everyone's sort of going through similar things, I guess. So yeah, it does help as a coach. I think, yeah, as well, to be able to have those conversations and just let the athletes know that you're there, and you're there to listen and speak to them, whatever things they're going through in their judo, in their life, all that kind of stuff. So,
also, you mentioned previously you spent quite a lot of your career kind of around Bath and whatnot. I guess the first question is, how did you get into judo in the first place? What kind of drew you towards the sport?
Yeah, so I started judo when I was 8. The reason being, I was kind of dragged there because my brother wanted to do it. So I didn't really know what judo was. I wasn't particularly interested in doing it. But the reason there's a bit of a family link. My uncle was a really good judo player as well. So he was like a bit of a young talent, if you like. He was a European medalist and 5th place in the Junior World Championships. But he didn't continue with his judo career much beyond juniors. So there wasn't a crossover where he was doing it and I was old enough to know that he was doing it, but it was this thing that had happened in our family in the past, if you know what I mean. We knew that he had been this good judo player. So I think with my brother being a little bit older than me, he knew a bit more about it, and that probably drew him to do it, to try it. So he went to the same judo club that my uncle started at, and I was basically forced to go with him almost, because brothers, probably a lot of energy. I know there's 3 of us, so 3 boys. I know for a fact we were a nightmare. So typical boys, like fighting all the time and like causing mayhem at home. So I think that was probably part of it as well, is getting us to go somewhere where we were allowed to fight and we were allowed to kind of get that out of our systems. So I was strongly encouraged to go with my brother, and I remember not necessarily liking it at first because it's quite a scary thing to go to. It's physical. There's people throwing each other around on the floor and all sorts of stuff going on. But I sort of stuck at it because I guess I was pushed a little bit to stick at it. But then quite soon found that for me, I like the discipline side of it. As a kid, I kind of bought into that side of it. I like that aspect. And I eventually liked the competitive side of it as well. So the club I went to, which is Devizes Judo Club, they would do every Friday. They would do kind of within the club like a competition. So you would fight people. It was like a league, and you'd fight people on that league, like the challenge ladders we called it. So you could challenge the person above you and get to the top of the ladder. And once you start getting competitive like that, and seeing that at the end of the year, whoever's top gets a medal, that was pretty cool. So yeah, I started because of my brother. Probably loved the discipline side of it, and then eventually, liked the competitive side and the fact I got to fight my brother as well. That was Devizes Judo Club was my first club at 8, and I stayed there till I was still training there on and off when I was 17. So quite unusual, really, that you go to one club as a really little kid, and that is your club for such a long time. I was just, I think, looking back, I was extremely lucky that my parents took me to that club, because there's a lot of clubs out there. There's different levels, different experiences I could have had as the first time going to judo. But luckily, I was in a really good club environment with good coaches and good parents and good teammates, and it kept me in the sport. I ended up doing it hopefully for the rest of my life, and I'm a coach now, and it's all started there.
In judo, like the discipline and kind of respect side of it is quite an integral part of the sport. How do they drip feed that into you at that younger ages? Because obviously I imagine it must be quite hard to get a 7-year-old or 8-year-old to be respectful and
Good question. And I don't know if they do drip feed it in, but I think from my own experiences trying to coach kids, there is different situations where you might need to. So I was in a club environment, so it was really well established. Those kind of social expectations and behaviours everyone's doing them already, because the club's been around for generations, so it's always sort of led on to the next generation. And we chatted a little bit more before we came on air about kind of the players start kind of policing it, if you like, and making sure those things happen. So you very quickly walk in as a kid even, and you're very perceptive to, okay, this is the way things are done here. I don't remember ever needing to be told to behave in a certain way, or bow when I got on the mat, or shake hands before and after fights and things like that. Everyone was doing it, and they're your peers, so you did the same thing. But I have subsequently coached in a school environment where it's different. So you have typical model is you have your school club, so that's where kids start judo, and then you try to bring the ones that are more either talented or just keen into the club environment. So that's not the same. We don't have that same sort of set expectations in the school. You're trying to build it from scratch, and it is much more challenging. But the big one is, I guess, we start the session as we mean to go on. So the thing about judo, it's all about respect for your environment, respect for your teammates, and kind of respect for yourself. So simple thing, when we step onto the mat, we bow. Before we start a session, we will line up and we kneel up, which is a little bit uncomfortable, but it sort of gets everyone's attention. And then we bow to start the session. So I think that's a big one, that it just sort of sets the tone for as you mean to go on for the class. Don't start the bow until everybody's lined up quietly, everybody's paying attention, and I think that sets the tone a little bit. But we still have challenges, definitely. I found in the club in the school environment, just different mentality of kids. I think the club, it's very much kind of, you walk in the door, everyone's bowing when they walk in, bowing when they get on the mat, listening to their coaches, not answering back, treating each other with respect, bowing before they fight, shaking hands, and you just see it straight away, and you feel like it's natural to kind of follow on. And then by the time we get them here, it's just completely normal. It's part of the sport. It's not part of the club identity. So it's not like we'll get some from some clubs that don't have the same behaviours. It's part of the sport to have those behaviours. So wherever they've started their judo, chances are they've learned all those good habits. So we're lucky in that respect. I think, I don't know about football, but I can imagine in other sports there's some clubs with really good standards and really good values and others that don't. I think in judo generally it's pretty good across the board.
Just respect for almost the overriding name of judo and all that type of stuff, and everyone buys into that identity and whatnot. Yeah,
it's the moral code of judo basically, and I think kids probably don't stay in the sport if they don't buy into it. They just don't. Most of them do buy into it because it's just everybody around you doing it, and it's a really positive environment. But I think if a kid for whatever reason couldn't, they probably wouldn't end up staying in the sport.
So obviously you've alluded to there the kind of pathway for a young judo player. Can you elaborate on that in terms of how they go from just starting out first ever session to then coming into like a performance environment and selection for possible national camps, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say there is quite a clear there's a clear structure in place in terms of the network of there's school judo clubs where you start your judo career, which are very much about fun, kind of just learning judo techniques. Not in most schools you wouldn't actually fight or compete, but you would learn techniques, you would learn that kind of moral code. And then you have your clubs where you'd start to actually compete a little bit more and learn more of the sport of judo, the competitive sport of judo. And then there's things like full-time training centres and then the national centre. But even though that network and structure exists, there isn't necessarily a clear pathway that links it all together. I think it naturally happens, but it isn't set in stone like a football academy where you have scouts and you pick up kids, and then they come to an academy, and then there's a cut-off point, and then the next, it doesn't work like that. Probably partly because we don't have as many kids doing judo, so we can't be as kind of, our aim is to retain kids in the sport as long as possible and work with whoever we've got, because we don't have enough kids to necessarily pick the best ones. We have people that end up as national level players that aren't necessarily talented judo players at all. They've just sort of stuck in the sport long enough and worked hard enough to get to a level. So there's not so much like a selection process at the regional level and then a national level in that way. For example, in Bath, most people at a reasonable level have the opportunity to come in as a full-time athlete. They don't have to have got on the national team to get in, to get a foot in the door. Obviously, once they're in, they have to sort of meet a certain standard, mainly on behaviours, to stay in the system. But it's not as kind of results based as you might think on the surface. But basically, think of a kid as the example, the typical pathway, which again, like I said, is not necessarily set in stone, would be they might try judo in their school, because normally it's a judo player that's competing at a national level that's trying to fund their competitive career might start a school's judo business as their way to fund themselves. So I did that. A lot of people do that. So that person's going out into schools, teaching judo to kids as a way to bring in share the sport, but bring in a bit of income for their own competitions. This kid tries judo, likes it, and then hopefully that player then signposts them to a club where they can take it a little bit further. And then it's all kind of, hopefully they go to the right club, because there's such a variation in terms of the level of clubs and how competitive they are as well. So, and also there can be a bit of a culture around, not once a kid's in your club, you want to keep that kid in your club. So some kids might be unlucky that they just might end up going to the club that doesn't ever let them go on in the pathway. But hopefully that kid gets into the right club, and they get exposed to the right training and the right competitions. And then from there, they don't have to necessarily make it to regional level first. They can go straight into a national level competition if they're good enough. And then if they get a medal at the national championships, then they could become part of the British team. So they'll get invited. This typically probably be kind of the first opportunity would be, well, there's home nations before that. So say this kid competes on a national level, does or doesn't get a medal, but they might then get invited to the home nations program. So that'd be English, Welsh, Scottish, obviously. And as part of that program, there's maybe 5 squad trainings per year. They'll get invited to those. If they perform, show the right behaviours, they'll get selected for a few competitions. But at this stage, they'll still have to fund a lot of it themselves. So you're dependent on parents and things supporting the journey as well. So say this kid's got support from their parents, they get a little bit of support to go on these tournaments. They start doing well. Then they could potentially make it onto what's called now called the EDS program, which is Elite Development Squad, which is a GB program. So it's from the home nations to the GB program, and that's a sort of junior age band program where they start to get a little bit more invested into them. So at this point, they'd still be probably either in their club environment, but they might have gone on to, say, university and be based somewhere like Bath. So they're training potentially full-time, but maybe some of them still in their club environment. If they perform in those tournaments to a good enough degree, they could then get invited to be part of the British full-time setup, which is in Wolverhampton. So that's kind of where British Judo want to try to bring in all of their talented players and base them in one place. So it's a very centralised system. Once they're in that system, they're kind of on the pathway. I guess they'll start to get a lot more support in terms of funding and support services and more selections, and that will continue as long as they keep delivering through to their senior career. But a lot of them don't necessarily go through that pathway because that's a very limited number. So kind of just at that EDS phase, kind of junior level, sort of 18 to 20, a lot of them will either be based in their clubs, but then might come to somewhere like Bath, or there's full-time centre in Camberley as well. There's Scottish Judo, I've got one in Ratho near Edinburgh, and they might actually stay there for the rest of their career. So either because they haven't quite made it into that British centralised group of players, or they've chosen not necessarily to be based there. So there's still a pathway that person can get to Olympic level based in their own full-time centre. The level of support from GB Judo they would be quite different. So we have players here, for example, still trying to get to that level or at that level, but because they're not based in that centralised system, it means they have to self-fund a lot more. Some of them have ended up sort of transferring nations to fight for different countries. So the 2 Fletchers, for example, that I mentioned, they used to fight for GB, but because they wanted to stay based in Bath, they've moved to fight for Ireland, so they can still get supported and do that. So very long-winded answer. Sorry, I know I've talked for a long time, but basically, there's the school judo, and there's club judo, and then there's kind of lots of competitions all around the country which peak at kind of national level competitions. Do well in the national competitions, get onto the sort of home nation program, do well on that, get onto the GB program, and then hopefully stay on that. So that's the shortened version.
So it sounds like it's quite probably the environment that people are in is quite a big thing for how they develop.
Yeah.
In terms of the younger age groups, they obviously, if you get the right coaches, get drilled in the right way, all that type of stuff. Do you think that's the reason for why some athletes stay in certain areas? So you mentioned you stay in Bath. Was it because of the coaches you had here and the training partners you had here? Was that
I think that's a big factor. And I think by the time you get to... So for me, I felt like I was quite settled. I'd had a relative degree of success through being here. I trained here from the age of sort of 15, on and off. So by the time I was think I was 20 where I was starting to get pulled to join this. It wasn't Wolverhampton at the time, but it was another centralised system. I felt like I'd already been here for, I'd been here for 5 years. I'd had success, and I believed in what I was doing here. So it was quite late, in my opinion, to change and move. Looking back, it probably wasn't that late, but at the time it feels like that. And I think it's mainly based on coaching is a big thing, but also a big thing in judo is partners. So we're very much a partner-based sport. You can't train and be good on your own. Like, I know that sounds obvious, but the main stimulus and the main improvement we get is from fighting. So fighting other partners. If you're in an environment with good partners for you, even if there's another environment where you will get more support and more funding, and maybe there's more coaches and more, other things that are better, I think partners is such a big thing. So for me, I had really good training partners, in terms of dedication, but also level, and that was a big thing for me. And then coaching as well, because coaching is what's got me to that point. So it's definitely a big thing.
So how does it work? Obviously, when you're in training partners, you all have your own weight categories and stuff as well. Assuming you probably need to fight people similar weight class to you.
Yeah.
But obviously, you then, I guess, if you're both of a good level, kind of competing against one another to then progress or selection or that type of stuff. So how does that dynamic work?
Yeah.
Coming from like a team sport, I'd find that really hard to go against the same person day after day after day and then not be any clashes or...
It's a unique part of judo, I'd say, not just within the club environment, but also on a world scale. So we're a funny sport in that we will do a competition. So, for example, the Paris Grand Slam that I talked about earlier. Big competition, really important. Everyone is there to try and win Olympic qualification points to go to the Olympic Games. It's one of the biggest and most important things that they'll do to get to the Olympic Games. After that tournament on Monday, so they fought on Sunday, on Monday there's a training camp and everybody fights and trains together. It's really, really unique and quite a cool part of the sport. So it's like, imagine you got all the best players from Southampton and different Liverpool and all these teams, and they have a match and then they train together the next day.
Cup,
It's really, really unique. But it's such a part of the sport that it doesn't feel odd to us at all. And I guess it's a battle of like strategy in terms of who can use it the best to their advantage. So you go to those training camps, fight your rivals, and try things, experiment with new strategies, take information from the fight. I'm sure they're trying to do exactly the same thing to you. So it's great. We enjoy training together. There's a really good camaraderie around with your rivals and teammates, and even if you're fighting for the same spot or fighting against that person for qualification, there tends to be pretty good camaraderie and friendship. I think because partly the sport's just a tough sport and not a glamorous sport in terms of the prize money and all that stuff. So there's that sense that everyone's in it together. But yeah, in the club environment, it's probably a little bit harder in the club environment. The hardest thing is when you compete against each other in competition. So training doesn't, from my own experience and from what I've seen as a coach, normally isn't an issue. So we'll have players the same weight categories fighting for the same spots, training together, and I think because the sport isn't huge in terms of numbers, they're normally grateful to have a good partner to train with. But when they fight in competition against each other, which does happen, like club within the same club competing in competition, that's a really odd dynamic, and that's a really high pressure fight. I think because you're going to go back to the club environment and one of you's won and one of you's lost. So that sort of status that comes back with you is a big thing. So that's the most challenging ones, I think.
Did you have that at all in your career here or not?
Yes. Let me think. Team Bath, yes, a little bit, but not as much as others, because I was for most of the time I was the only person in my weight category. There's a lot of people category below me or category above, so great training partners, but not head to head in terms of competition. And the times where there was people in the same category as me, there's quite a big difference in terms of the stage of our career and the level we were competing at that time. So it wasn't such a big thing for me, but for other people it was. Yeah, the weight category below, we had two guys that were both sort of international level that would compete against each other quite regularly, and that was always fun when they come back to training afterwards. But,
you probably feel bad enough, and then everyone's giving.
Yeah, exactly. People tend to be quite sensitive around it, but yeah, I did have it at the funny one at the Commonwealth Games competing for England, which usually we compete for GB, but obviously Commonwealth Games competing for England. I shared a room with the guy that I was the other England fighter in my category, and then we fought in the final, and he won. And then we had to stay in the Commonwealth Village for another week together afterwards, in the same room. So that was okay. It was fine. Like I don't know if it would have been different if I'd won, but it was okay. But it's I guess it's character building part of the sport. You have to deal with it. Take out the ego side of it and keep it on the mat as much as you can, which some people are better at than others, I guess.
And so, would you, during these camps, or like you said, just after Paris Worlds and stuff, would you teach each other techniques that maybe it's, say for example, you're going against someone that you knocked out in the semi-final, for example, with a particular technique, like, how did you catch me? Is that something that you would do that knowledge share, or?
I think it's bits and pieces, probably not to that much of an extent. I think if you've got an advantage, you'd want to keep it, and if you felt like that was the key advantage as well over that person, you probably wouldn't want to share it. But in general, you would share a lot. But it depends on how close things are in the situation. I think as a group now, for example, these guys, we do sessions. We do normally 30 minutes coach led and then 30 minutes player led, where they work on their own stuff, and they do teach each other stuff all the time. And there's things that they are in tune to that we as coaches wouldn't be as in tune to, because we're not in the thick of the sport as much. There's other things that we would see that they wouldn't see because we have that overview. So it's really good for them to teach each other and some of the nuances of different techniques.
That's something that's always taken place.
It's more so now.
As in with them taking ownership of part of the session or learning.
Yes, but it's happening more now, I would say. So when I was training here before the 3 years that I was away, we did little bits and pieces of that. And I think the time that I was away, that changed quite a lot, for whatever reason. So Adam came in as an assistant coach, so maybe he was part of that change. And by the time I came back as a coach, I was told, this is kind of how we do it now, which I think is great. So I really bought into that, and it's something that I think we'll continue with. We did bits and pieces of it before, and I think most clubs will do bits and pieces of it, but it's something that we do. Yeah, we do it regularly now. I'd say not with a sparring session, but with a technical session. Pretty much every session we'll do it, and I think it's been really, really effective. I think the players like it as well, because when you're training full time, even though you're training twice a day, it's surprising how little time you get to work on the things you want to work on if it's coach led all the time, because we're trying to coach 30 people who are all at different levels, different styles of judo. They might have completely different interpretation of the sport of judo. So as a coach, it's so hard to run a session and we've only got 2 coaches, so we can't split the group up into lots of different groups. So you feel like some of the stuff you do, it's not that it's not relevant, it's relevant, but this is what I want to work on. I'm not getting a chance to work on it. Like, when can I have time to work on this? So I think giving them that time, they really appreciate it.
And do as a player, do you go, I know that I need to work on this area? As in, is that a personal thing where you work that out, or is that something that coach says to you, you struggle in this area? It's
a bit of both. I think it's a spectrum, depending on the player. I think some players, there's probably a trend towards the more elite ones, but not necessarily. Some might be young and very sort of self-aware, but some have a very sort of acute awareness of what they need to work on. Others really have no idea, and they just get on the mat and fight, and they have other strengths in other areas where maybe their strength is that they're not scared to just fight anyone, but they don't think about their judo as much. So it depends on the person. A lot of the times it's us just asking the right questions, because if it comes from them, it tends to be a bit more powerful. But there's definitely other players where we need to sort of hint a lot more strongly about what we think, but it depends on the player. We have a couple guys now that we don't really need to say much to at all. A lot of it will just be reinforcement or encouragement, because they're just really good in terms of knowing what they need to work on. One thing that I find really helps is not to tell them what I think they need to work on, but to sit down with them, watch their fights, discuss it together, and give my opinion on the fight. So look at the gaps together. From that, they'll often come away with a different perspective of what they think they need to work on, but it still might come from them, but based just on that conversation. So
it's interesting how you can give athletes that level of ownership over their individual performance plans. Obviously, I work quite a lot with younger age groups, and a few years ago I was working with the older ones, tried to give them that thing of going, listen, we got footballs here, we got poles here, we got thing. These are types of sessions you can do, but I guess at the time the culture wasn't right for them to go out and stay extra to do bits that they wanted to work on, particularly when it's cold and windy outside and stuff as well. But that must be powerful in terms of giving them the ownership to go, actually going to work on.
I think so. I mean, I think like you alluded to, it's a lot of it is probably the age band that we're working with, because you're working with mostly a lot younger kids.
Yeah, younger.
So we probably wouldn't do that as much with that age band. We might do a little bit, but in general, it's hopefully by the time they've gone through that system, we're not having to teach them judo anymore.
Yeah.
Because of this age band, we try to give them a bit more. But there's a big range within that. So the way I would normally run a typical session, which there isn't really such a thing, but the closest thing to a typical session is I might kind of do some games around a principle that I want them to think about, and then a few.
What type of principle?
So it might be a principle. We did some stuff on a lot of stuff on how you use your body weight to move your partner. So how you kind of imagine two people stood up, gripping hold of each other, so holding each other's collars. If you just pull with your arms and try and pull that person towards you, you're probably going to have some success. If they start leaning back with all their weight, it's going to be a bit more difficult. So it's a combination of that pull, and then you might lean back as well, and kind of that gives you extra power into that pull. But obviously you're not just trying to pull, you're trying to move sideways, you're trying to circle, you're trying to push. So we did a big block on this recently, kind of how you use your body weight and keep tension between you and your partner, so that wherever you move, you'll have an impact on where they move. So we did games with belts around each other's waist, and you're linked together by a belt, and we did stuff where you're not allowed to grip them and they can grip you, so you can't pull with your arms and you have to lean. So silly fun games like that, where they will start to use their body more because they have to win that game. And then I might explain, okay, look, this is why it's working, because you're using your body more, because you're doing this. And then maybe I would give them a few examples of how they can then apply that to their judo, and, pull your partner in order to set up this attack, or to get this reaction, to throw them the other direction. And then after we've done a few of those examples and maybe a few more specific drills, then it's kind of their free time. So they've got that sort of inspiration or feeling or orientation of the session. They've kind of understood that principle and they've started to demonstrate it, and now it's like them to apply it to their judo. So we would still, as coaches, kind of go around and pick up on things or observe or ask questions, but it's them trying to bring it into their judo, and I guess probably a big part of it is because they've all got different judo, so we have to give them that time to then apply it to their judo. We can't, or it's sometimes difficult to structure a session so that if you don't give them that freedom, how are you going to apply it to all of their judo? So yeah, it works well. I've found that has worked well. I think for certain principles they lend themselves to that structure better. For other things is a bit more difficult. For example, a big thing in judo is grip fighting. So kind of imagine, to execute a throw, you've got to get your hands in a certain place on the partner's kit. It gives you enough control and enough leverage to execute a throw. That person knows you're trying to do that and knows exactly where you want your hands. They've got a strategy for where they want to put their hands on your kit. So you're trying to do that to them without them doing that to you. And it's the grip fight is a huge part of the fight. And that side of it, there are things we need to teach them, like patterns and tricks and setups that we need to teach them. And then, so that might be more challenging to do in a sort of principle games based way. So it depends on what we're trying to teach. But yeah, as much as possible, I try and give them that space. And then when I'm walking around the mat, there's some of them that I can just leave, and there's others that I do need to be with, like the whole time, sort of, why are you doing that? Why aren't you doing this? Like, what happens if you do this? So yeah, very individual. And
so is a lot of your work with them initially game-based stuff, where you try and make it like a fun
yeah even though they're at a kind of more advanced age, definitely they train all the time. They're tired a lot of the time. So if you can make it fun, I think I don't see any issue with games making it fun. It was a little bit different with Jürgen, our old coach. So he was more sort of different mentality around training. Should be very focused and should be very quiet and very sort of, just a different atmosphere. But we have a different approach. I think the players appreciate it. They switch on more. They're a bit more engaged. And I think if you can make games really specific and you can constrain a game to make it develop a skill. We're not just playing games with them to make it fun. We're not just trying to make them happy and have a great time. We're doing it in a way which is, this is what we're trying to develop. So yeah, it's fun, but it's for a reason as well.
And then when they're constraints-based coaching, if you like, and there's something that's coming into football more and more, in terms of when we're doing games with the kids, trying to put constraints on a way to get a certain outcome, would you then constrain when they go into like their own individual 1v1 work, or would you kind of let them just spar normally?
Bits and pieces. So we constrain the spars quite a lot. But I would say there's probably, depending on the phase we're going through, if we're going into a competition phase, they're just about to compete, we wouldn't necessarily constrain things as much. But then we might as well. Say if a player has a real specific weakness on, the big thing in judo is how you control your partner's sleeve. Imagine with two right-handed players, we both want to put the right hand on the collar, and that's how we throw from. So you're trying to control my sleeve, and I'm trying to control your sleeve. So the sleeve battle is like a big thing in judo. So if somebody struggles with that, we might do sparring. We call it randori, where they start with their own sleeve pinned, and they have to break that off first. So we might constrain it, but then the rest of the spar is still open. But then if they don't have that, generally the nearer to competition, the more open and general the spar would be. That would be like a normal, it's close to a fight. We're not trying to manipulate it too much. But if we're in a tactical, technical, specific phase, we're trying to develop something, then we would constrain the spars, and we might say you can only attack with your feet, you can only attack in a certain direction, or one person has to close the space and getting close, the other person has to keep distance. So we do play with that stuff a lot. But we also personally think that we have to leave enough room for just open normal sparring as well. But then within a technical session, it's a mixture of certain things we let them just do their own technical stuff, but then other things, like the example I gave earlier, we give an orientation to the session, and then the technical work has to be linked to that orientation. So it's a real mix and match.
I'm guessing if you're working on a specific principle, and then you're asking them to spar, is there always a willingness for them to try and give it a go? Because I'd imagine that sometimes if people go, it's not an area of weakness. I think most people, if it's an area of weakness, they'll give it a go because it needs to improve. If it's something in the middle of the road, they go, actually, I wouldn't use this technique because I'll do this one instead. They may be more inclined to kind of go towards that other technique that they'd use because they don't know it. So is there a willingness from most people to give those techniques a go, or do you get some athletes that go, actually
we do get that, definitely. We definitely get that. And then I think in that situation, it's on us to ensure. I mean, sometimes we just either we get it wrong or we can't. It might just not be relevant. It might genuinely not be relevant to that athlete. So fair enough. We might have just done a session where we've got hopefully 90% of the people it's relevant, and they're just, by the nature of it, there might be a few that it's not. But if that's not the case and we just haven't got the buy-in, I think it's on us to kind of explain why we're doing it, and we try to do that as much as we can. If you go as a player and it's a game and you just don't get why it links and why we're playing games, this isn't, so it's on us to make sure there's an understanding. And I think that happens off the mat as much as on the mat. So those conversations we have with the players around the development of their judo, what they think their weaknesses are, and how we can target that with a specific thing that we're doing or constraints-based activity we're doing, why we're doing that. So it's our job to make sure they understand, I think, and generally if they do, they buy into it, and I think the ones that buy into it, we see them develop. So far so good.
So you mentioned kind of about the differences between maybe when you're going through a development phase to a competition phase. Can you talk through, this is quite an open-ended thing, but
sure.
what like an entire year for a judo player looks like in terms of how many competitions they do, big ones to trying to gain in points or anything like that, and then how your training is then catered to those competitions and kind of what those cycles look like.
Sure. So it's very different depending on the level they're at. We try to match them up in terms of timing the year so that we can, as much as possible, sort of keep them on the same program wherever they are. So if you're a top international player, for example, now is right in the thick of the Olympic qualification period. There's a ranking list, a world ranking list. Every tournament of a certain level that you win fights at or win medals at, you get points. At the end of 2 years of qualification, top 18 people in that ranking list in the world in each weight category qualify for the Olympics. So there's 40 competitions a year. It's insane how many tournaments there are, because one tournament as well is not just one fight, it's 6-7 fights in a country 10 hours away flying, and then the next week it's somewhere else 6 hours away. So that is really intense, and the better they do, the less they have to compete, because the top, across those 2 years, in each year, the top 6 results that you get count. So if I go back to my Olympic qualification, I would go to a tournament, not get the medal I wanted, and I'd have to do the next one, and I'd have to do the next one, and it would just carry on like that. So you very easily fall into the cycle of competing every weekend, whereas ideally, you pick up a medal, you can have a break, and you can prepare for the next block. So yeah, that level, it can be every weekend. We try to avoid that as much as possible, and we try to split the year into kind of 3 blocks times 2. So we'd have like a general prep phase, a competition prep phase, and then a competition phase, and we do that sort of twice in the year, maybe 3 times if we have to, and the length of those phases would change depending on the calendar and how the athlete does, really. But the big ones that they'd be aiming for would be sort of continental championships, which would normally be around April-May time, and then world championships around September time. Obviously, with that being Olympic year, it's slightly different. So Olympics in sort of July. So we would try to phase the training around the periods they have to be, the competition periods around the key qualification events we want them to do well in. So for example, Paris, which was in middle of February, was right in the middle of that competition block, and then we would kind of line a few tournaments up in that block. So there's Paris, then they'd fight Dusseldorf, which was the week after. 2 weeks later, Morocco, which is I think this weekend, and then maybe one more tournament, and that would be that block. More development athletes, their season looks really different it depends where they are. So if they're top end junior, they would have a similar year in terms of a European Championships and a World Championships at slightly later in the year, but we could try and still line up things similar to how we would with the senior athletes. But there's only a few that we have, firstly on that Olympic end, and then also on that sort of Junior Europeans World. The vast majority are just below that. So they are trying to break into the British team to get considered for things like Junior Europeans and Junior Worlds. So for them, there's tournaments kind of all year that can potentially count towards that. And what we do is we try to pick ones that fit within the phases we've already got, because we try as much as possible to keep them as a group, and they're all doing the same kind of blocks at the same time as each other. So there's sort of shared experience, and just managing them is a bit easier as well. So we would look at what qualification events for those guys that could help them break into the British team fit around the same period as the competition events like Paris and Dusseldorf and those big ones. So we try to phase them together as much as we can. So yeah, that's loosely our approach, but it doesn't go, you write it down on a piece of paper and it doesn't always work like that, depending how the athletes do. They might get a call from GB saying, we want you to compete here, which might completely not fit within our plan, so we have to change things on the fly. But that's just, that's as it goes.
And what were the differences between building up to a competition week? Say if you're building the week before Paris, for example, to a development week, what would those 2 weeks look like? What are the differences between the two?
Yeah, so I guess the big one would be volume of work would be most of the time significantly less, and the intensity would be probably higher in that final week before competition. But that does also depend on the athlete a little bit. So as an example, sparring is a big one. In terms of sparring for us is a big load, big training load. It's the equivalent of our kind of sprints that you might measure with GPS. So we would reduce sparring in the lead up to a competition, particularly in that last week, but we would do it shorter and much more intense, so even potentially above competition intensity, so that when they go into competition they're fresh because they haven't trained too much, but they're kind of firing on all cylinders in terms of the pace of the fight and their intent in the fight. Whereas in a development phase we might do kind of constraints based randori or more open randori, which is a bit lower intensity, but we'd probably do a lot more of it. But yeah, because the intensity is lower, they can handle more of it. So development phase a week, we'd have 3 randori sessions where they would do maybe 6-7 5-minute rounds in each session. So it's quite a high amount in total. Whereas leading up to competition, that final week, they might do 3 fights on a Monday and maybe 2 on a Wednesday, and that would be enough. But then some athletes might be different. Some athletes just might enjoy the feeling of training in the week of a tournament and might feel just they don't enjoy that feeling of tapering too much. So we might sort of try and keep the volume a little bit higher for them, but then it's again managing intensity, because we can't keep the volume high but increase the intensity because they're going into a tournament. So as a general rule, intensity goes up, volume goes down, but there's wiggle room within that, I'd say.
And do you do a lot of support stuff around it, like strength conditioning, gym and all that type of stuff? Yeah.
So we're lucky here, we have really good support in terms of S&C. So we have a guy called, I can't even say his last name, Harry Chismich. Harry Chismich. So he's like the lead S&C coach for Team Bath and specifically Team Bath Judo. And then we have basically every year we get different interns. So we've got a lady called Izzy at the moment from Loughborough University, who's kind of our intern for the year. So she's really involved in the S&C side as well. So they get typically 3 S&C sessions a week in the gym, and then they would do sort of conditioning stuff, either mat based or track based, which tends to be managed more by the judo coaches, but we would design it with the S&C coaches. But yeah, all the strength work is done in the gym with the S&C team. And then we have once a week a kind of prehab stability balance session on the judo mat delivered by one of the physios. So as a team we work quite well together. We meet and discuss the players quite regularly, what the phase is, what we're working on. So that'll be the 2 judo coaches, the S&C coach and intern, and the physio kind of working as a unit as much as possible. So it works really well.
So you're looking at probably like 4 additional sessions in and around.
Yeah, so
your training type stuff.
Yeah, they would have typically 3 sparring sessions a week, spaced out through the week. So ours is Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Other places might do like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but we do Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. They'll have a technical session, which is not sparring at all. It's just kind of principle-based games, and then it might be individual time, or we might teach them something specific. We'd have them 3 days a week, so Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and they'd have S&C in the gym Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then sort of conditioning track sessions Tuesday and a Saturday usually, and that does change a little bit depending what time of the year we're at. So they're doing 12 sessions a week, so it's quite a lot that most of them are doing. So one of the big things we have is they come to us at 18 usually. Some of them have trained quite a lot, some of them have trained every day, some of them have trained twice a week. So, and they all come in like all different levels, all different training histories, and it doesn't mean the ones that have trained twice a week aren't as good. They might be better, but they've all got very different backgrounds, and then they get put into a full-time environment.
Loading.
It's completely different. So the S&C team have done a great job this year of they've sort of put on like a freshers program, they've called it. So they do completely different gym work than the rest of the guys for 3 or 4 months, and they kind of have to graduate that program before they move on to the full-time program, and that's been really good. It's been even more effective than we expected in terms of injury reduction. Just they've got the core movements nailed down now, and they're able to load. We look at some of the other ones we've got who didn't go through that, and they still can't do basic movements properly, and it's really challenging. So that's something that we'll definitely carry on with, but also we're sort of toying with the idea of how we do that in a technical way as well. So we teach them all together at the moment, and like they're all at different levels. So do we do something similar where we have a curriculum or a thing they have to graduate before they train with the rest of us, the rest of the group, and we're just figuring out what are the things that they should demonstrate first. How do we manage it in terms of with the amount of coaches we've got, because we still want them to be integrated and part of the group. So it's the proof of concept is there. It's just kind of how we do it with judo now, I guess, is the challenging part.
Almost like football pre-season, that
exactly.
You come back in, you had a month off or whatever it is, or a month where it's not as much loading.
Yeah.
And then I know there's a lot of talk about football, the GPSs and type of running sessions, type of gym sessions, how much you loaded them early on, so they don't get severs or all that type of stuff.
Because what would you do? Because typically, my perception of pre-season is it's like the hardest part. It's really tough. Yeah. So then, how do you do that when they've gone from doing very little, and then actually that's the highest load they might have?
So what we do here is, although we increase the load on them, we're sensible how hard we're asking them to work in the first couple of weeks. So weeks 1 and 2, although they're in more, we might not. We don't play any games in those first couple of weeks normally, and then weeks 3 and 4 you might increase the load off, and then what the academy have actually thing is we have a week before the start of the season which they have off, to try and allow them to think over Christmas. Obviously we have a break at Christmas. We have we go to a place down in Devon which is like a multi-sport thing, just try and get them back being active again. And
that's
then,
fun.
Yeah,
is it the Wipeout thing?
No, it's Oakhampton.
Okay.
So they've got a massive hotel down there.
Okay.
Where they've got loads of different sports like that. When we've just gone this year, they were doing pedal karting, tennis, swimming, all that type of stuff. So it just allows them to get active without it being a constant load of the same thing. But I think it's a classic thing in football in terms of trying to balance we want to get work into them, and we want to be able to play games so you can work on your technical and tactical bits. But if you load them too much too early, either they'll break there and then, or when you get into this season at October, November time, you break. Which is why obviously the calls for the winter break in the Premier League is such a thing.
It's crazy the amount of games some of the teams play now. When I look at it, and like the turnaround between games. It's crazy. 3 or 4 days. I spent a little bit of time up in Edinburgh with Edinburgh Rugby, just sort of shadowing one of the S&C coaches there, and they have 5-6 days, and just between games, and seeing how frantic that is, and how quick they have to turn that around and re-strategize and change the load and all those moving parts, and that's like they have pretty much consistent 6 days. I can't imagine 3 days, 2 days. Didn't Liverpool have one which was 24 hours? They had 2 games or something.
So luckily they had 2 teams at that one, but it's
crazy.
I know that, like, if you look at teams like Man City, probably the biggest things of it, and Liverpool to a fair extent, is because they play in 4 different competitions. That just loading, I think last year, maybe, and I could be wrong, I think Manchester City played like 8 games, all of which only had 3 or 4 days breaking the thing in a row, 8 to 12 or something like that, which loaded for players is I mean, they're fortunate, they got quite a big squad. But that loading thing pre-season is a big one. So I guess, like, obviously when you're going into competitions and stuff, you're probably not walking around at the weight
that's a big
that
one.
you're competing at. So I'd imagine there's weight cutting.
There's definitely, that's part of the sport.
So for people that don't really understand exactly what that entails, could you explain, like, for you, if you're going into the Paris Masters, whatever it was, what you'd be walking around at, if you don't mind divulging and then what you're competing at, and what that process is to get down to the weight and when you have to do it, and all that sort of stuff.
So like everything we've talked about, very individual. Some people don't really cut that much weight, believe it or not. Other people cut silly amounts of weight. So weight cutting is part of most combat sports, I would say. Boxing, MMA, huge in MMA, just culturally huge. Judo, wrestling, anything like that. So that is basically where you would compete at the lightest weight possible that you could get down to and still perform at some good level. So artificially bringing your weight down against your body's natural kind of the nature of where you would sit normally on a day-to-day basis just for that competition. So you might weigh your fighting weight for literally 5 minutes while you step on the scales and get weighed in. Every minute before that you're heavier, and every minute after it you're heavier. And the really broad way to look at it is you want to be as light as you can be and then compete kind of as heavy as you can be, but there's obviously things around. You don't want to just stuff your face and feel terrible when you step on the mat because you're bloated.
And then the big one's hydration, right?
Yeah. So the big strategy, I guess, typically is, and it is maybe slowly changing, but not really to the degree that you'd hope. The big thing is hydration, because hydration is a way that you can quickly bring your weight down and then quickly bring it back up, and not be hopefully depleted. You want to deplete yourself as late as possible. So for me, for an example, I wasn't a big weight cutter, but I was it earlier on in my career. So until I was 20 or 21, I used to fight under 73 kilograms, which is 11 and a bit. And I used to weigh typically 82 kilograms. So I'd lose I got up to 85 kilograms. So I was 2 stone I'd lose for a competition at one point. And I was a youth athlete at the time, really. I was still only 20. To do that, I would probably 4 weeks of like nutritionally altering my diet in terms of eat less food. Maybe, I didn't really know what I was doing at the time, so I'd do all sorts of weird things. But eat a bit less, reduce carbs, which big debate around if that's actually the best way to do it, but it sort of does help you lose weight. Whether or not that's good, you can't really train like that, but still I would reduce carbs, and then get my weight down to maybe within about 4 kilos of my fighting weight at the start of the week of the competition. So maybe on a Monday I'd want to weigh around 77, 78 to weigh in at 73 on like a Friday night or a Saturday morning, and then from then on I didn't really have I couldn't lose any body fat. I was, so lean that the only way I could lose the rest of the weight was through fluid. And at the time I was terrible. I didn't know what I was doing. So I would just stop drinking for the week, or like not for the whole week, but, hardly drink anything at all that week, and just get as dehydrated as I could and get on the scales and weigh 72.99 and then drink as much as I could and eat as much as I could afterwards, which was terrible. Not a good way to do it. And I would fight sometimes good, but often really bad as a result of it. Because at that time, you had to weigh in on the morning of the competition. So you'd weigh in on a Saturday morning, fight on a Saturday at you'd weigh in at 7 and fight at 9, or 8 and fight at 10. So the time to rehydrate is like so minimal. It's a little bit better now because we weigh in like a Friday night and fight on a Saturday morning. So you'd weigh in at like 7 o'clock on a Friday night. And I have learnt more and got better. And so towards the end of my career, I was weighing 85 maybe and fighting under 81s. So I'd lose about 4 kilos. So it wasn't a lot that I had to lose. I didn't really have to adjust my diet. I was fairly lean anyway. So I'd just lose the last bit with hydration. But the way I would do it was much different. So I would stay hydrated and train as normal. And then the day of the weigh-in, I would just go and do a lot of saunas and things like that, which sounds more extreme. And it is potentially, I guess, still very risky, because if you spend too long in a sauna, your body temperature goes up massively, you've dehydrated yourself, you can't bring it back down, it can be really dangerous. But I don't think I was ever that extreme to get to that level. But the benefit, if you like, or the less bad part of it is you're depleted for less long. It's a short window of time that you're dehydrated. You're doing it right at the last minute. And then you can sort of rehydrate, and the effects are less, hopefully, because your body hasn't been in a depleted state for as long. So I'd do that and then weigh in at 7 o'clock, and then I would just electrolytes and try and rehydrate and get into the competition the next day, feeling most of the time reasonably good. But I wasn't a heavy dieter. That was 4 kilos. There's people a lot more than that. So there's all sorts of things going on that are not particularly safe, but that the good thing is international judo has recognized that. They're trying to combat that as much as possible, and I think it is slowly shifting. So now we have to weigh in again on the competition day. So they've moved the weigh in the day before, which means that people can rehydrate and fight in hopefully a better state. One of the side effects of that was that people felt, oh great, I've got 12 hours to rehydrate now. So they would lose even more and drop down categories and things like that. So in order to combat that again, they brought in like a day of the competition weigh-in, but you have an allowance. So you have to weigh in on your weight the night before, and then the next day you have to be within 5% of your weight. So if I'm under 81s, the next day I have to be 84.9, I think it is. 84.1, whatever it is. So it hopefully means that, because you wouldn't really want to hold your weight down on the day of the competition. You're gonna weigh in and you're gonna eat and drink as much as you feel you want to. So hopefully that means by checking that they're within 5%, that is more of a ballpark figure of their natural weight. And it still isn't, but it's an improvement. And then there's a lot more around education of young athletes, which is good. So when I was a kid and I remember being, 12 years old, competitions, coaches encouraging me to cut down weight at 12 years old. It would not happen anymore. I mean, it does still happen in very small amounts, but in general, that education around that is a lot better. So you'd hope that generation, as they come through, they've got that better education. I know from working with England judo at a cadet level and GB under 21 level, there's a big push towards fighting in your natural weight. We weigh them at national squad trainings, but it used to feel like you were weighed traditionally and that felt like a weigh-in. You had to show you were underweight. It's different mentality now. We want to see what your natural weight is so we can guide you to compete in a category that's best for you. So it's definitely getting better, and the education for coaches is better, for athletes and sort of at that national level is definitely getting better. And then once they're a senior and they're an adult, it's more kind of understanding around what can they do safely, and it's more sort of they can make that good decision for themselves. Us as coaches, we have athletes here, we push them to go up a weight category if we think they need to. We're lucky here in Bath, we've got like a DEXA scanner and things like that, so we can look at their body weight, look at their body fat, can they actually make that weight? 10, 20 years ago that didn't exist, and people were just judging by feeling. So yeah.
So obviously the majority of people don't fight or don't spar or anything like that. What does that actually feel like?
Yeah.
What does that feel like, draining yourself that much to get? Because particularly I like MMA. You see it on the scales of thing. TJ Dillashaw was a big one in a minute.
Yeah.
Looked like he was basically dead. I think he tried to get down to 125.
Crazy.
And I've never seen anyone alive look like that.
Yeah.
What does it actually feel like to deplete your body that much?
Yeah.
And then trying to fight? And then what's the differences when you go up a weight category in terms of obviously you're fighting at a similar standard, all that type of stuff, but slightly heavier and
yeah. You feel it's sort of, there's a bit of science to it. You can regulate things and try and do things as professionally as you can so that you give yourself the best chance of feeling okay after you've weighed in. But there's a big element of just your body's so complex and it's potluck how it feels. Like you sometimes feel okay, sometimes you feel absolutely terrible. Like you might wake up the next day and just feel like you've got no energy, you're completely drained, you feel heavy, in terms of, you're not heavy, but everything feels slow and lethargic, and then you've got to try and fight. You know what I mean? You can hardly even, look after yourself. You've got to try and fight. So it's really potluck. And like I said, you can manage it, but it doesn't. Even if you do everything right, you might still feel like that. So it's really tough. Some people I think some people's bodies are better built for dealing with it than others. Some people seem to be able to cut hard and sort of still be okay. Other people don't. I'm sure it's very complex. I can't really explain why. And then there's definitely a sort of like a mentality aspect around mental toughness and things like that. The old phrase is like making weight is your first fight. So it's like people treat it like that. And if you can get through that, then everything else is easy. But the big thing for me, the big message from my experience and from what I've seen as a coach of athletes, normally when they go up and they fight a weight category above, they do better. This whole culture around it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's just because everyone's doing it. It's just the thing you do. So everybody's cutting, but you end up fighting. So you're cutting, but you're fighting other people that are cutting. If everyone just didn't cut, you would fight the same people most of the time, just in a weight category above. And from my own experiences, when I was cutting 73s, you feel like you have to do it because this is where you've had success and this is where I'm going to be stronger because I'm bigger. But the reality is, obviously, you've cut, so you're not necessarily, you might have a bit of an advantage, but you're also depleted. So whatever advantage you think might not be what you expected. And when I moved up to 81s, I did so much better, like almost instantly. And you feel like, what was the fear? Like, why was I scared of that? So generally, most of the time it seems to be better to go up and just feel good and feel like you haven't had to kill yourself to make your weight. Times when you might still choose to go down might be where there could be a specific opponent that you can't get past in the weight category above. So this is where it might be, for example, Olympic selection. If it's GB and there's some absolute superstar in the category that actually is your natural weight, and you just know you're not going to get past that person, that might be a factor that would make you cut down. And maybe there's some argument there that it makes sense in terms of for your career. But in general, from what I've seen, there's like losing a bit of weight is one thing, but extreme dieting, it doesn't seem to make sense a lot of the time. When that person goes up, often they do better.
And then you said earlier that you fight 7 or 8 times over a day or a weekend?
Over a day, so all happens in one day. So the people that have cut a lot, it depends. Like sometimes they'll feel it later on, but as a general rule, because I think if it was because the weigh-in is quite close to the competition, they're still kind of recovering and hydrating through the next day. So if you know somebody's cut really hard, you kind of want that person in the first or second round. If you fight them later on, they've drank more, they've rehydrated, they're heavier, they're feeling better, and they kind of grow as the day goes on. So those people, better to get them early on.
And can you see it? Can you see them walking around the place going, I know you've had a...
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes especially when they get on the mat, you see it in when they fight. You see them how fatigued they get, how quickly they tire, and they just look like they've got no real sharpness or pop in what they're doing. Exactly. I'm sure there's probably an argument that you would maybe fatigue more. Your endurance would go down as the day goes on. But from what I've seen, it seems to be the first couple of rounds they really struggle, and then if they can sort of get through those. That's how I used to feel. If I could get through those and I could keep hydrating, and as the day went on, you'd kind of feel okay as the day further through the day. So yeah, if I'm coaching somebody and I know they're fighting somebody who's cut a lot of weight, I'll just be like, just keep the pace high, drag them into the later stage of the fight, like make it a really physical fight, because they're gonna come out hard and try and get it over and done with, early. And then they're gonna fatigue massively.
And then, so obviously you're fighting 7 or 8 times in a day. How much time do you look at who your opponents could be? When do you find out what your road to final whatever might be? And do regions have styles of how they fight, or is it each individual is relatively different?
Yeah, good question. So that's for me personally, I changed a bit towards the end of my career, but for most of my career, I like to plan the day quite a lot. So I'd look the day before the draw would be made. So they would make the knockout sheet for competition the day before you fight, or 2 days before if you're fighting on Sunday, because the competition is split over 2 days. So lightweights on the Saturday, heavyweights on the Sunday, and normally the draws would be done on the Friday. So I would look at it on the Friday night as soon as I could, because I like to plan my strategy against my opponents, and kind of, if I didn't know them, for example, look them up on YouTube, find a few videos and plan what I'm going to do. And I would look fairly through the competition. I didn't suffer from kind of doubt of, I'm going to meet this person in the quarterfinal and that's a fight I won't win. I would be confident to think I would go through the rounds. When I got older, and that sort of bulletproof confidence wasn't as, you just get older and you start having more doubts and whatever's probably normal. I wouldn't do it as much. I would normally look at the first fight and just that first fight of who I'm going to face. And I would do that the day before. So I always wanted to know the day before, but not necessarily look through the whole, just look at that one first fight, or ask somebody to look at it and tell me. Other people don't like to know until the day of the competition, which for me seems mad. I would hate that, because I would still be worrying about it and thinking, because I'd like to strategize. I'd be thinking about that. Who could that opponent be? And I would probably get a terrible night's sleep and all that stuff. Other people, it's the opposite. Knowing who it is what's going to keep them from getting a good night's rest. So they would look on the day. So they wake up in the morning, get to the venue at 9 o'clock. They might be fighting at 10, and they're like, okay, I've got this guy. Fine, let's do it. So it's really individual. And then your other part of the question around styles is, definitely. There's broad regional styles, but it's still very individual. So there's kind of is a Japanese style in terms of, they're going to have quite technical judo, quite good posture, stand-up judo, but there's still the techniques that each player would do might be different. So you tend to have one or two key throws that are your big weapons, and each player would be different, whatever region they're from. But the style of how the pace of the fight, the sort of the posture, you can sort of group them into styles based on Japanese versus French versus. Within that, there's variation. Like British, for example, we don't really have a style. We're just all different, which is kind of maybe a strength because you can't really prepare for a British player. And then I think maybe the sport's becoming more globalized, so that the lines are a bit more blurred maybe now as well. Everyone's sort of got access to YouTube, and everyone's learning from each other. There's styles, but variation.
And then as you're going out, like obviously you've mentioned there that you used to plan kind of who you might have, all that type of stuff. Obviously that could change throughout the day, depends on who wins or loses, if there's injury or anything like that. How much time would you spend on the actual day going, I've got this person, so I should focus on this and this? Or would you just go, I kind of know that they do that, I'm going to focus on this area of my game?
So not a lot of time. It'd be like a chat with, like a 2-minute chat with a coach normally, and then it's kind of all about bringing it back to you, bringing it back to you as the athlete. So what's your strategy? What's your strength? What are you going to do against this person? So you look at them, have a conversation around what's the key thing that I need to prevent them doing to be able to impose what I want to do. And just try to simplify it as much as possible and not overthink it. And you can't think about the whole fight and what if this situation happens and what if this it's normally around their gripping strategy. So what is the key grip they need to do most of their judo from? Have that conversation, identify, okay, I need to make sure they never get this hand here, or I need to get this sleeve, or whatever it is. Once you've established that, it's kind of from then on, it's all kind of the same patterns around your mental prep, your visualization, your breathing stuff, but focused on that one key thing. For me anyway, I wouldn't think about too much. So once I've identified that, I go through the same process of kind of, I talk about my strengths and what those my key things I wanted to do my breathing to get myself to the right stage, and then remind myself of that trigger, that strategy. Not overthinking is probably not a good thing, because like football, is so complex, there's so many variables. If you think about every single thing that could happen, it's just gonna be too much.
So it must, I guess as a coach, it must be quite enjoyable for you to sit in the background and almost be able to go, his next opponents are on that mat over there, I'm going to go and work out who wins, and then I can go back to them and say, you're facing this guy or this girl, they do this, this is what you need to do to counter that, and make it like really clear and concise for them in terms of what your game plan coming up will be.
Yes, that's the key, like you said, that's key thing, clear and concise, and really simple, really short, one key thing, and that's it. That's the art of it really on the day of a competition, and then managing it and delivering it in the way that works for that player. So for some of them, you'd ask them what they think, and for some of them, they want you to tell them, okay, you need to do this. So I enjoy it, and I'm still discovering that and which approach works with which players. But it's cool. It's the competitive part of coaching. That's, you're still competing as a coach at the competition because you're still looking at the fights in that way. It's cool.
And I'm right in thinking that you went out to Japan for a year.
So I went. So there's other players. I've been to Japan many times, many times. Not the
research was wrong.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. It might have been one of my teammates did go for a long time. I've been probably been about 8 times as an athlete. The longest I went was probably 7 weeks.
Okay.
But it's like the place you go and train if you want to have a high volume of good partners. We talked about earlier how important the partners are. You come to a judo this is a training centre, so it's it's not just a club, it's a place where people come from their clubs to train, and we have maximum of 25 players on the mat at one time. You go to Japan, you'll find dozens of dojos with over 100 players on the mat, wherever you are. So the number of partners is huge. So that's where you go to get big volume of good quality partners. And it's a cool experience as well. It's a totally different culture. It's the home of judo. You sort of see that side of it. So it's an awesome experience.
And is there any differences to what they were doing over there to what you'd experience here?
Yeah. So they have a much bigger talent pool, and their technical level is a lot higher, a lot younger. So I would generally go and train there in universities, which is where the judo is really based. So it's similar to Bath in that they tend to tag it on with an educational institute. So you would do judo through your high school, and then you would go to university, and that's where you would train sort of full time and compete internationally. They don't do any, very little anyway, like teaching, very little technical training, because by the time they get them at university, they have all the tools they need. So they have all the judo. They've got their ABCs down, like from their club and their high school experience. When they come to university, they just spar. That's all they do. So they do sparring for 2 to 3 hours a day. And they've got enough partners that they can get variation and different styles and not get bored of. Well, I'm sure they do get a bit bored, but they don't need to do much else really. Whereas we don't have the same level of players come through the door, and don't have the same number. We couldn't do sparring anyway because we don't have enough partners to do that much sparring. Everyone would get fed up of fighting the same people, but we just don't have the same level. So we have to still coach, and we have to still learn, and be a lot more it's probably a lot more complex what we have to do we have to squeeze the most we can out of the players we've got. And even if the player doesn't really have much of an aspiration to be a top player, we still have to try as much as we can to retain them in the sport, because they're a good training partner for the players that do want to. So we have to try and keep everyone involved and get them to the best level they can, even if that means they're just a slightly better training partner for the guys that are on that level. And they don't have that challenge at all. They have literally it's like a conveyor belt. Everyone's on that conveyor belt. The best ones will make it off the end. Like so many of them will not be able to sustain the training. The training's too hard, so they won't reach the top level. But they've got so many, they know that some will come through. So it's totally different, just based on numbers, really. But there are similarities, which is cool in terms of like the values that we talked about. It's, obviously it comes from that Japanese culture, so it's still very respectful of the dojo and the surroundings, and tend to be respectful of you as a fellow judo player as well, even though they want to like kick your ass on the mat. Nice to have those common things wherever you go in the world for judo. So.
Right, well listen, I'm going to wrap it up now because I know that you need to go at 1, and it's about 5 to 1.
Oh, wow.
But I really appreciate your time, and if you're up for it, I'd definitely love to get you in and have a chat, because I really enjoyed that.
Definitely, Mike. Yeah, I'd love to come back, and good luck with the podcast. And yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me.
Cheers to that. Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.